Hello, and thank you for listening to Living Wealthy Radio, heard around the web on livingwealthyradio.com, iTunes, and Blog Talk Radio. I am Teresa Kuhn, helping you live wealthier. Resources are available for you at livingwealthyradio.com.
Could you use more power of persuasion in your professional dealings? Do you sometimes feel like it's not easy getting a potential client, employee, or partner to say yes? No matter what area of life, from personal relationships to investments to your career, everything is a negotiation. And if we understand the nature of negotiations and how to get from no to yes, our lives could be enriched in so many ways. Our guest, Herb Cohen, is an expert on the art of negotiating who has advised U.S. presidents, Fortune 500 companies, the CIA, FBI, and many others. He's the best-selling author of You Can Negotiate Anything and Negotiate This, Caring but Not That Much. He's going to share with us how to enrich our lives by seeing everything as a negotiation and understanding the power of getting the yes we need and want. Welcome to the show, Herb.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Absolutely. So is it true that absolutely everything is a negotiation?
Well, everything that is the product of a negotiation is, of course, negotiable. And therefore, if you deal with what isn't a product of a negotiation, that would be ethical, moral, and religious principles. For example, the Ten Commandments was not a negotiated document. The Lord didn't say, hey, I got these 15 commandments, and Moses said, well, I was thinking along the lines of 5, and the Almighty said, let's split the difference. That's not what happened. The Sermon on the Mount was not negotiable. Jesus did not get together with his followers and say, well, let's come up with some principles for living. That's not what happened. So those things, ethical, moral, religious principles, would not be negotiable, but everything else is. The price you pay for a car, when you go into a store, whether it's Neiman Marcus or Macy's or any store at all, that is negotiable. If you go to buy a piece of furniture, a stereo, a new iPod, that's negotiable. And so virtually everything can be, not should be, but can be negotiated.
So who do you consider the best negotiators in our culture?
Well, as far as my own experience is concerned, it's not one of our presidents. Most of them, in terms of negotiation, give ineptitude a bad name. But it's probably children, and all of us are exposed to children, whether they're our kids or kids that we see or relatives. We know that children who have very little power at all, the little people in a big person's world, they seem to get whatever they want or come pretty close to it. And what do these kids do? Well, number one, they aim high. They understand that if you expect more, you get more. And so from the parents' point of view, children always seem to be making unreasonable demands. But that pulls up expectation and is good. The second thing that these kids understand is that no, N-O, is not a final statement, but rather it's an opening bargaining position. And so whenever you approach a parent, for example, with a new idea, a new request, their first reaction is to say no. And that's true not only with parents, but people in general. Why? Because if you are surprised, you will say no. And if you change your mind and go from no to yes, people like you. They say, hey, what a decent, reasonable individual. But if you were to blurt out yes, and then later on say, well, remember I told you yes, make that no, people feel you've reneged. We have terminology for that. He, she went back on their word. And so kids understand that they want to aim high. Number two, know is an opening bargaining position. Number three, they form coalitions with other people that influence the decision makers. In the case of kids, when they go to their mom and she says no and the father backs her up, he says no, it seems, that's the end of it, but not for a child. They move up to the next level, grandparents. And it's easy to form coalitions with grandparents because they together have a common enemy, the parents. And last of all, kids persist. They are tenacious. They don't give up. My wife and I, we are the parents of three children. Our oldest child, our daughter, we used to have standards, and we insisted she adhere to those standards. Second kid came along. We had the same standards, but we had a few exceptions that we would make. Third kid, we were tired people. We had been through this before. I remember saying to my youngest, why don't you ask your brother and sister? They'll tell you how it used to be around here. And so my point is that these are good negotiators. Some of the things that they do, we ought to adapt. We ought to raise our expectations as to what could be accomplished. Two, we recognize that no is a position people take at a given point in time. When they say no, it's no right now, but in 20 minutes it might move. Other information may become available, and like kids understand that. Three, we form coalitions. We recognize who can influence the decision makers, and four, we're tenacious. We don't give up. So that's it, kids.
Kids, fantastic. So what are some of the biggest negotiation mistakes that you've seen people make? And actually, before you answer that, why don't you share a little bit of your background, because you've been involved in some of the most historically important negotiations of our last 30, 40 years in the history of our country.
Yeah, although I don't like to talk about myself ordinarily, and, people ask me, give us your introduction, and I don't have an introduction, and whatever anyone says about me is fine. I've been involved in a lot of things. I was in the military service. I came back. I went to law school, and my wife and I, she was going to college. I was going to law school. We were both full-time employees, full-time students, and we had no money, so I got a job, and the job I got was a claims adjuster in the streets of New York. This is kind of interesting because my family never negotiated anything. They always paid retail because their attitude was, hey, don't make waves. They'll raise your rates. The insurance company will, or they'll cancel you. Hey, I'm just happy to be here in America. And so I didn't come from a background of negotiation, but this job involved negotiation. I was very good at this job, and I kept getting promoted, and the company I worked for was Allstate, and I ultimately became a corporate officer in the company, and then went on to work for Sears, who was then the largest employer. Then I was with IBM. Then I went into business myself. I taught at the University of Michigan Graduate School of Business in Ann Arbor. And then I worked for the FBI, the Justice Department. I worked for the FBI for 28 years, and then I was involved in the Iran hostage crisis and worked with President Carter and Cyrus Vance and gave them advice, which by and large President Carter did not listen to. And so I was known in Washington as the guy he should have listened to. We were dealing then with rug merchants in the Persian Rug Sellers Bazaar. Americans don't like the word negotiations. My wife, for example, used to refer to it as haggling, chiseling, and she would say to me, look, I don't lie for money. The implication is that I do. But when they took hostages, they had at the end 52 hostages, they saw themselves, the Iranians, as having 52 hot rugs for sale, and they were trying to get as much as they can for their illegally obtained merchandise. And President Carter, he walks into the rug sellers bazaar and tells them, I need the rugs. I want the rugs. They're the centerpiece of my foreign policy. And if I don't get them back, I won't even campaign against Teddy Kennedy in the primary. And he tells the American people publicly, everybody pray for the hostages morning and night. Everybody light a candle. In fact, tie a yellow ribbon, preferably around an old oak tree. Would you believe none of this stuff helped the hostages get free? It only made, the song made a lot of money for Tony Orlando and Dawn.
Tony Orlando.
Yeah, and so, the point is that, see, what we were doing is when you create more demand, the price, what they want for the hostages, doesn't go down, it goes up. And so unintentionally, we were prolonging the captivity of the hostages. Then after that, I went on to advise President Reagan, and then I helped the FBI set up the hostage negotiating program. You name the university, I probably have lectured there. I kind of get around, but in my case, do not confuse movement with progress. And so, I've always worked. I've always been in demand. I have ideas about a lot of things, most of which are not listened to at all.
Well, very interesting history, though, and you're considered to be one of the top negotiators in the country, if not the world.
Yes,
so somehow you've made negotiating an art.
Yes, well, it's something that everybody does. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're in business, you spend your time negotiating, without realizing it. And every dollar you can save goes right to your bottom line. That's the stuff that keeps you in business. And so, like America, we don't negotiate with other countries in the world. That's why we have these big deficits. So my point is, Donald Trump is right about a couple of things. That's one of the things he's right about it. The question is, will he do something about it? I don't know if he can. He doesn't have enough people. He doesn't bring in the right people.
So the title of your most recent book, Negotiate This by Caring, but Not That Much. Is that the secret?
Well, that's the number one mistake that people make. They fall in love with something. In other words, if you walk into a jewelry store, fine jewelry, and you see a bracelet, a ring that you love, and you say to your spouse or to yourself, I need this, I love this. I can't walk out of the store without it. It's the most beautiful, gorgeous thing I've ever seen. your ability to negotiate is greatly handicapped because you fall in love. So therefore, rule number one, biggest mistake people make is they fall in love with something they desire. See, whether it's a ring, a particular car, or anything, they fall in love with it. And so rule number one is don't fall in love with anything but people. Don't fall in love with material things. Fall in like. In other words, I like this thing. I like the ring very much. Why do you think I'm here? Because I like it. However, I've lived a very good life before this, and without that ring, my life will go on. And you see, if that's your approach, you do well. Now you say, well, that only applies to, something in a store that you purchase, in a retail establishment. No, that applies to everything. For example, we have a deal that we made with Iran. Now, that's not a treaty, that's a deal, okay? Because that's very much, like what happened in Chicago during Prohibition, where the gangsters split up the city. They had a deal. In essence, this past treaty, see, President Obama came to power feeling that we were too involved in too many wars, and he wanted to get the troops out of all of these particular places. So his big need is to bring all these troops home and end our involvement in all of these Mideastern wars. He knows that if Iran continued to develop its nuclear weapons, even if we didn't do anything about it, Israel would have to do something about it, which would cause Obama to strike back, not even at Israel alone. They'd strike back at the United States because in their eyes, we're the great Satan. Israel's only the little Satan. And therefore, we would be in an enormous war. So he goes into this negotiation with Iran whereby he must make the deal. They can't walk away. So no matter how bad it is, they're ultimately going to have to say yes. He falls in love. He doesn't see any other options. And please note the behavior of John Kerry, our Secretary of State, who, by the way, knows nothing about negotiations. He pays retail for everything, even his boat, which he bought for $8.5 million. His specialty is marrying rich women and paying retail for everything. He never once acted like he'd walk away from the table. By the way, the Iranians did several times. They went back to Iran, they came back, So the other side has got to feel, hey, this guy might walk. He might break off the negotiations. And if they feel you won't, you're going to make a deal, they will give you rigid terms or terms that can't be enforced, and you will do poorly in this negotiation. So I'm saying to you, in negotiations, you want to care, but not that much. You got to say to yourself in every negotiation, this is a blip on the radar screen of eternity. This is a walnut in the batter of my life. I'm caring, but not that much. I'm prepared always to walk away. And if you remember that and you do that, you will find suddenly things will come to you. In other words, you start out of the store and walk to the door, the guy will follow you. He'll follow you out into the street. And if he doesn't, he says, he gives you his card and says, Mr. Cohen, Mr. Jones, why don't you give me a call when you change your mind? Don't take his card. Say to him, no. Here's my card. You give me a call. And you will find that within the next month, you'll be getting a phone call from him. Why? Because his boss will say to him, hey, you haven't sold a car in a month. You know, you have a quota. You're under quota. You want to lose this job? Bam. He whips out your phone number. You get a phone call. Okay?
Fantastic. Yes. So what would you say is, you know, when you're negotiating and there are concessions and agreements, how do you navigate through that? Because, you know, negotiating, you can negotiate anything, right? But
yes.
Most negotiations have many different parts and concessions to them.
Yes. Well, see, what you do when you negotiate, okay, first of all, you recognize this is a game. It is the game of life. I'm caring, but not that much. There are many things much more important than this game, and that's your attitude going into this game. Then you always say you care, but not that much, and then you limit your authority. See, when you go into a negotiation, you're not the final decision maker. In other words, you're going to buy a car, and the salesman, the salesperson, saleswoman will say to you, well, Teresa, I guess you can make the deal right now. I mean, you're a very responsible, you know, person, a high achiever. You'll say, well, of course, this is subject to the approval of my lawyer, my accountant, my husband. Even if you're not married, you say that. In other words, you don't want to have total authority, because that's the second mistake. You try to limit authority. There's got to be somebody else to go back to. Then, when you negotiate, you know, you start off always in an amicable fashion with a low-key pose of calculated incompetence. Do not tell the other side how brilliant you are. Let them figure it out, if they ever figure it out. You just, you know, you walk in, you know, and obviously, you know, I'm trying to make a deal. I'm trying to resolve this particular problem. You try to ask more questions than you give answers. You actually listen to the other side. When they say something you like that moves you to your goal, you nod and you smile and you reinforce that. You say, hey, that was great. That was so good, okay? When they say something you don't like, you don't say anything, okay? And then you know, see this as a problem to be solved, and then recognize that most concessions occur in proximity to the deadline. So if you're having a slow start and there are barriers, recognize this is normal. See, you always go that way in a negotiation, because unless there's some deadline of sorts, people don't make concessions. And so, just going back to my other example, in the Iran treaty, Kerry, our Secretary of State, kept moving the deadline. The Iranians are aware he keeps moving the deadline because he wants the deal so much that they don't make concessions, because concessions and agreements occur at the deadline. For example, when the people file their income tax returns, everybody files in the last 3 to 5 days, okay, like 90%. You say, yeah, well, those are people getting money back. Statistically, that's true with the people getting money back. No, that's true not just with the people that owe money, but it's also with the people that get money back. It doesn't make any difference. Everybody follows, you know, files at the very end. For example, you give a secretary 7 days to type up a report. When will you get the report back typed? Probably, if you're lucky, in 7 days. Okay? Give a kid 3 months to do a term paper in school. And we all have these assignments. When does this student start the term paper? Right
night
at the
before.
end.
Right?
Yeah. 80% it's the night before. Now, is that a good habit? No. Does everyone know it's not the right thing to do? Yes, they know it, but they can't help it.
It's human behavior, right?
Yes. We're all affected by deadlines. And so you got to realize if things are going slow, that's because the other side doesn't perceive it as a deadline. And in fact, here's another thing. If virtually everything is negotiable, a point I tried to make earlier, well, what about deadlines? They come about as a result of a negotiation. Therefore, they're not as firm as we think they are. And so what I'm saying, if I get you to believe that this is literally the deadline, okay? In other words, if you go beyond that, you're into the abyss. Deadline, past the deadline. And I know, there's a deadline, See, you're looking at it literally, I'm looking at it figuratively, advantage to me. In fact, even after the deadline passes, I sit there at the table, with my head down like I'm really deeply depressed. And I turn to the other side who are packing up their bags leaving because they know we had a deadlock. All right? It's failure. They got to go back and reveal a deadlock. They're depressed. I turn to them and I say, now that it's over, where did I go wrong? What could I have done? What should I have done? Help me. And they will say, well, it's over. You could have done A, B, and C. Had you not said this. And so what I do is I do those things that they've advised me to do, and I resurrect deals that have already gone down. In other words, see, my attitude is every breakdown is a potential breakthrough. Every exit is an entrance someplace else. Even pathology can be an opportunity. And so, if that's your attitude, you'll be surprised how well you will do in situations.
What do you mean by pathology?
Well, a diagnosis of illness. They say, hey, you have a problem, medical problem, and some people see that, it's the end for me. I only have 6 months to live or whatever. And some people view it as an opportunity to do things, to change their lifestyle. And some of those people actually live well beyond what, is told to them as the deadline. We all know cases like that. People get virtually a death sentence, and 20 years is still around.
So are we born negotiators, or can anyone really learn to be an effective negotiator? Obviously, this is a talent that you've developed over many, many decades, but it's just, I think from a cultural perspective, right, like you mentioned, the Persians, they're born into a culture where they're always negotiating. And we here in the United States aren't necessarily taught that, although there are those that, seem to negotiate better than others.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
No, I believe that, you see, negotiators are not born but are made, and I try to give you the example that my parents, who never negotiated anything, and I was thrown into a situation where I had to learn it, and I learned it. But you can become a negotiator, and people become negotiators in terms of what they do. In fact, the United States, at one time, we were known throughout the world as great negotiators. The days of the Yankee traders where our sailing boats across the Atlantic, and we were involved in trade. Americans were known as the people that would really make, great deals because they were negotiators. And why? Because we had a society where, a few bucks here and there, see, we weren't wealthy, really made a difference. Now, here's what happened to America. World War II ended. We suddenly became the only game in town. And so we were manufacturing cars for everybody. We were manufacturing refrigerators. The Germans weren't doing anything. They weren't competition. The Japanese weren't competition. All these other countries in Europe were doing nothing. And so we started to negotiate, and they would say, like, for example, the Brits, by the way, yes, we want all these cars, but we want the steering wheel on the right side. What our attitude was? Hey, you get it on the left side like we do in America. In fact, I'll tell you a story. This is absolutely the truth. Sikorsky Helicopter Company, which then was part of Pratt and Whitney, but now is part of United Technology, formerly United Aircraft, was making helicopters, and they had a monopoly, and a manufacturer, some company wanted to buy helicopters, and they said, will you paint it red, white, and blue? And they said, no, this is the Sikorsky color for the helicopter. It was some sort of, green, like camouflage green. And the company said, no, we want it red, white, and blue. They said, no. And so they went to Bell Helicopter, the purchaser, and said, would you do it? And Bell Helicopter went into the helicopter business. So I'm saying is that we got spoiled after World War II. We didn't have to negotiate. We stopped negotiating, and people didn't realize they could. And then the department stores where people shopped in those days, you didn't have the availability and options like you have now. They would make you feel embarrassed if you negotiated because they'd have to train people in negotiation. So you'd go into a store, Bergdorf Goodman, a classy store, whatever a classy store is, and you'd say, well, I'd like to pay this, and they would look at you like, please, you're in Bergdorf Goodman. Mm-hmm. They'd make you feel like you're on holy ground or something. But in truth, you can always and could always negotiate, and people learn to do this. And, you got to believe it makes sense. See, I used to be in my many jobs. One time I was in what we called corporate personnel in the headquarters company. And today it's human resources. And I'd be at lunch, and some guy would come up to me and say, hey, we were just doing a pay grade schedule. What should they be, for this job? Some people say the top pay should be $1,500, a month or whatever, a week. And some say $1,500, some say $1,800, some say $2,000. What do you think? And I take a bite of my sandwich and say, well, some say 15, some say 2,000. Make it 1,750. And that, since I was his boss, that became the top of the grade, 1,750, and it would now be part of a printed manual. 1,750, like it was ordained by the Almighty to be 1,750. No, I made it 1,750. While I was biting into a sandwich. My point is, half the things you're talking about come about as a result of a negotiation. Anything. Like the speed limit. How do they decide what the speed limit should be in a particular place?
I guess they negotiated.
Of course they do. One person says this, one person says that. Somebody says, well, I don't know, that seems a little high, or that seems a little low. what about this? Would you buy onto this? Yeah, and that becomes, or anything you think of. It comes about, the price of something, 990, and 68 cents or whatever, In other words, they don't want it to be $100, so they make it $99.50. Because 100 would put it in, the psychologically. So it's all negotiated. Everything's negotiated. Unless it's a religious or moral principle.
Fascinating. So interesting. Well, I know you've been negotiating for many, many decades. I don't want to ask you how old you are, but you have so much passion and energy at this point in your career for this topic. I can't imagine how much more passionate you were about this topic 20 years ago when you were in the middle of some really high-end, important negotiations. Any negotiations you're working on today that we might be aware of or familiar with?
Yes, I've done some work I'm still in the process of working with Condé Nast, and I don't know if you realize, they own Vanity Fair, the New Yorker magazine, and Vogue. And they wanted to get Vogue into China, and they were having a hard time, and so I was involved in that, and ultimately they got Vogue into China. And so I do stuff overseas. Like, I understand the Russian mentality, and I was involved in the START negotiations, reduction talks, when Khrushchev was there, so I know how the Russians negotiate, and even I have my ideas about the North Koreans, how to negotiate with Kim Jong-un, and he portrays himself as crazy, and that's the most difficult person to negotiate with, actually, is a crazy person, and the second is an irrational person, is a dumb person. And so one of the things I would advise your listeners is that when you negotiate, realize that dumb is better than smart, inarticulate is better than articulate, and train yourself in negotiations to say, I don't know. I don't understand. Would you help me on this? See, I'm kind of new at this. Or you've been around you compliment the other side. You've been around for so long. You've seen people like me come and go. Help me. In fact, that gives women an edge, because they haven't been around in business as long as men, overall. And they have, in fact, some things women have that comes easy to them, that is more difficult for men, is they have a better style. In other words, their demeanor, their manner. You always want to have a soft style. You want to be polite, and you want to listen, and you don't want to be, like the stereotype of a good negotiator. You don't want to be one of these people that pound the table and shout, raise your voice, or make all sorts of disparaging gestures while the other person speaks. And women tend to be, much more amicable and friendly, and that's good. That's really, good for any negotiator, no matter what their gender is.
Do these techniques still work for you? Like, if I was across the table negotiating with you, I'd read your books, I'd understand who you are, and I'd think that I could pick up on your techniques. How does this still work for you when you've written books and shared with so many people how to negotiate?
What it does is it reduces the gaming, and people say, okay, we got a problem to be solved. In other words, you don't try to do all these sleazeball things, that people do. You don't pound the table. You don't use emotional tactics. You don't walk out. See, because you know I know. And therefore we can get to the heart of the problem. How do we solve this in a way where both of us benefit? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make a deal here which is beneficial to you and beneficial to me. In fact, that's what you try to do when you go overseas, when you negotiate, say, in China or Japan, or for the most part anywhere. You try to understand the other side. You try to be patient. You see negotiating as a process. In other words, you don't try to be legalistic, which I find amusing. You know, people go to China to negotiate to the People's Republic of China, and they bring along lawyers. Why? They don't have a legal system there. So, you know, if they breach the agreement, you can't sue them. There's no legal system. Yet they bring along lawyers. You know, they're ridiculous.
Well, Herb, you really are such an interesting person. You've lived such an interesting life. Your techniques, your style, your art, actually, I'm going to call it an art form, is just absolutely fascinating. Thank you for joining us on Living Wealthy Radio today. And please let our listeners know how they can find you online.
Well, I guess you could find me at Herb Cohen, 427 at gmail.com. And then I have a website, which I don't really look at that much, but at one time I did write it, and actually it's pretty interesting. I am not that commercial in that I have probably a crummy website in terms of drawing viewers to it, and I don't really care. Or I care, but not that much. And I'm kind of casual. In fact, I never did any marketing. People would come to me. And so it's all like word of mouth. People recommend me. Hey, you got to get this guy. If he's still alive, check out. In fact, that's what I get. That's how I get business. People write me, my boss told me to call you if you're still alive.
So how old are you?
Well, I'm 83. I just was 83.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, my goodness. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. April 27th, that's my birthday. But I am fortunate. I lucked out. You know, I'm like in good health, and who knows? I'm surprised. You know, I did so much traveling. I really should be infirm by now, but I'm not. And I still, you know, travel, go to places. I'll be going to the Middle East July 1st, and that'll be interesting. And you know, people call me to ask me to do this, do that. And I, you know, if it's a challenging situation, I get involved.
Well, Herb, I wish you the absolute best. Thank you so much for coming on Living Wealthy Radio. I wish you just the absolute best and another, who knows, 10, 15, 20 years of doing your art.
Who knows? Remember, the greatest legacy you have in your life, the biggest thing you could accomplish is your children, your spouse, your relationship. And in the final analysis, that's really what enriches your life, and that's what you leave behind when you go. So, you know, people got to spend time negotiating those things as well.
Well said, Herb. Well said. Again, thank you so much.
Okay, thanks for having me. Good luck, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Herb.
You've been listening to Living Wealthy Radio, heard around the web on livingwealthyradio.com, iTunes, and Blog Talk Radio. Download or subscribe to our podcast to hear a new show every week. I am Teresa Kuhn, and I hope you'll join me again next week as I show you ways to live wealthier. Resources are available for you on our website at livingwealthyradio.com.